Hey guys, this is Nirpom from the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. Now today I've got a pretty exciting project to show you guys. I'm basically just going to put an underwater housing system together from Nauticam. So every underwater housing system is completely different, but I thought I would show you guys the general process for putting your camera together in your first Nauticam housing, whether it's a DSLR, compact camera, or Micro Four Thirds. It's going to be a little bit different for each one, but the process is generally the same. These days most cameras are mirrorless, and of those many of them are full frame. So I have a full frame mirrorless housing from our rental fleet. In case you didn't know and you were thinking about getting your first camera, we do rentals, so you can try it out. This is a Sony a7S III housing from Nauticam. We've got some ports, extensions, I've got the camera and lens, I've got strobes, arms, clamps, everything you need to get set up and diving underwater. I'll show you how to put it together, and we'll just go from there. This is going to be a pretty rough cut, a pretty rough video. I'm going to go through all the steps. I'll try to show you guys in detail what I do, especially if you're a new shooter, and show you guys some of the techniques that I recommend when you're first getting set up with your first underwater housing system. Alright, so I'm going to get to it and let's get started. Okay guys, so before I get started, let's talk a little bit about underwater camera maintenance. Your underwater camera holds out water with a device called an O-ring. Now, an O-ring is placed in any kind of groove or connection on your housing, any mechanical connection where water could slip in. It's basically a little rubber ring that keeps out water. Now, it's really important that you keep hair, grease, sand, anything that could get in that O-ring. You want to keep it clean. You want to keep anything that could get in it out of it, and you want to clean it regularly. I usually try to clean my O-rings before each dive, or before each day of diving, I should say. Sometimes I clean them once every couple days if I'm on a trip and I'm diving often, but if I'm not diving often, I try to clean them as often as I can. And the way you do that is you take a guitar pick. We've got our own Blue Water branded guitar picks, or you could take any kind of thin plastic. A lot of companies will sell their products with an O-ring pick. We've got O-ring picks on our site. I'll drop one in the comments below. And you take that pick and then you just go ahead and put it in the groove where you see an O-ring. You push it up a little bit and use your thumb to push that out. And with that motion, you should be able to pop an O-ring off. So, and you can see you want to be gentle with it. You don't want to stretch it too much, and you just take it off like so. Now, I will do this with every O-ring that has a major connection on my housing. All your buttons and stuff also have O-rings, but with a Nauticam housing, all the gray O-rings you can take off and you can grease them before a dive to make sure that you get all the sand off the O-ring and it stays watertight. So I do that on port extensions like so, port adapters like so, and then also you have a center O-ring in your housing right here, which I'll show you now. There we go. So there's a main housing O-ring right here, which I also grease really regularly. So, like I said, you can use the guitar pick to take it out. Then what I do, I run the O-ring through my fingers, and I just try to get all sand, grease, dust, hair, anything off. If you have pets, make sure you don't get pet hair on the O-ring, because hair is actually hydrophilic, and water will go from that hair into your housing. You'll get little drops in your housing. Even though the vacuum might be solid, it might show you that you're good, the hair can actually bring a few drops in, so you definitely don't want that. So I just run it through my fingers, make sure I'm all clean on the O-ring itself. Sometimes I run it underwater and I dry it. And then what I'll take is a pea-sized dab of grease. I recommend using Nauticam grease with your Nauticam O-rings. You want to typically use the manufacturer grease with that O-ring, because some O-rings can actually expand and get your seal stuck. So you won't be able to open your housing because the O-ring has expanded, so you definitely don't want that. And then I just go ahead and run a little tiny dab, a pea-sized dab of grease, and you want to make sure your O-ring looks nice and almost wet. It'll be a little bit shiny. You definitely don't want a lot of grease on the O-ring. If you have a lot of grease on the O-ring, that can also lead to issues too, so you just want a little bit. After that, I put my O-ring back in the groove by kind of lining it up like so. And you don't want to stretch it too much, but they usually just fall into place. And you want to make sure you get the right groove. You don't want to accidentally put it in the wrong groove and then have that port not be watertight. So that is how you clean an O-ring, and I wanted to start with that because it's really important you do that before each dive and before you even set up your housing system. Now, going back to the housing, I'm going to go ahead and put this back together. I wanted to also interject and say, whenever you're cleaning any grooves, Now, one thing I missed when it comes to cleaning the O-ring is you do want to also clean the O-ring groove. Now you have the O-ring groove right here. You want to make sure there's no dust, sand, hair, or anything in there. So I usually recommend taking a Q-tip that they sell at the makeup section in Walmart. It's not an actual Q-tip, but it's a makeup remover Q-tip that has no fibers on it. And I will push that Q-tip through and get all the sand and dust and everything out of there. Or you can also use a microfiber cloth. We have these microfiber cloth towels, so you can actually use one side to wipe water off your system and the other side has no fibers on it, and you can use that to clean any of the grooves that you need. So that's a pretty cool item to have as well at your disposal. And we sell those on our site, and I will also drop that in the comments below. So I'm going to go ahead and put the O-ring back on now. And now, with our maintenance done, after I've cleaned the port O-ring, the extension ring O-ring, the adapter O-ring, and the port O-ring right here, and the housing O-ring, now I'm good to go. I'm ready to set up the system. So I'm going to go ahead and put my grease aside. And now, let's go ahead and set up the housing, get the camera in the housing, get the ports on, and then I'll put my strobes on, video lights, and you can see how you build a full system from scratch. So starting with the housing, the way you open up a Nauticam housing is you actually have these two little levers on the back of the housing. On the side of the housing, sorry. The two levers have a red button. So what you do is you push the red button on either side, you pull the latches, the back housing panel latches up, and the back housing panel just comes right off. So what you have is you have a locking mechanism with these two little metal bars here. The two little metal bars line up with the two holes on the back of the housing. You push it in, and that's how you line up the back of the housing with the front of the housing. I often also like to do this by just putting the housing front in my lap, and then you can really easily take the housing back on and off, and it's really easy to do it that way. So that's one easy way to do it. Now that I've opened up the underwater housing, I want to put the camera in the housing. Now sometimes you can put the camera in with the lens on, but a lot of systems you actually have to put the camera in, then the lens from the front, then the port on in order to get your system together. So I'm going to show you how to do that, so that in case you do have a really large lens that just can't fit through the porthole from the back, you'll know how to do that just from watching this video. So in order to start setting up my housing, I first take a camera tray out of the center of the housing. Now how do you do that? The camera tray is inside the housing on the bottom. There is a lock right here on the bottom, and you push the lock to the side. That undoes the camera tray, it unlocks it. You can pull the camera tray out, and now this is what you put on the bottom of your camera in order to slide the camera into the housing. So in order to do that, all you have to do is take your camera, and every camera has a 1/4 20-inch screw mount right at the bottom of the camera. So you take the housing tray, you put it on the bottom of the camera, and you screw it right down. So now you've got a nice tight housing tray, and the housing tray will usually have a couple of levers on it. Those levers will press the lens release button. So the lens release button allows you to take the lens off the camera and put it back on again. Now, after I've taken the camera and I put the camera tray on the camera, I can actually slide the camera into the housing. So the way you do that is and it's going to be a little bit hard for me to do it backwards, you can put the lens through the porthole if you have a lens that's small enough, and you want to line up, here we go, I'm going to try to move so I can show you guys. You want to line up the camera tray towards the bottom of the housing, and then go ahead and lock it in with a lock. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to do. Here. There we go. Okay, it should slide right in so you can feel it. If it doesn't slide right in like you saw, then it's not gonna lock. Now I can lock the camera in. It's solid, it's not going anywhere, and now it's inside the housing. However, there are a couple things that you might have noticed. One, this lens is a zoom lens. So how do you zoom this lens if it doesn't have anything on it to interact with the housing? Well, you need to attach a zoom gear in order to zoom your lens with this zoom control right here on the housing. So what I need to do in this case is I need to take the lens off the camera, and I can do that by pressing the lens release button on the left side right here. And I'm gonna hit that lens release button and then turn the lens so that it comes off the camera, like so. Now we have a zoom gear from our rental department, and I'm going to attach the zoom gear onto the lens. So the zoom gear comes in two parts. The first part is an internal ring, and the internal ring fits right onto the lens, on the section of the lens where you would spin it to zoom in and out. Now the internal part of the zoom ring has these rubber stoppers on it, and these rubber stoppers are what give you the firmness when you put the outer ring on top of the inner ring in order to get the zoom ring to lock correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the inner ring onto the zoom lens, onto the lens, and it looks like that's the zoom component right there. You can see that the front end of the inner zoom ring actually has these two grooves on it. So that just slides right into the groove on the lens itself, and now I can put the outer ring, and I want to slide the outer ring onto the lens so that the teeth are on the back of the lens. And this can be a little bit tricky, a little bit tough, and did I get it? I think almost there, almost there. There we go. So you can hear that snap in, and now that lens is able to zoom. So now I've got the teeth on the back of the lens. Now the teeth on the back of the lens will need to interface on the teeth inside of the housing. So how do you get those gears to interface? Well, on the lens control mount, on the zoom gear, you can actually pull it out, which will pull the gear out from the housing on the inside. And when you pull the gear out on the inside, that gear is right back there, you'll be able to put your lens back onto the camera. And one thing about Sony is you never want to do this if the Sony is on, because it'll just collect dust. And now I rotate that lens onto the camera. I bring back the zoom gear, the zoom knob. And now using the zoom knob on the housing, you can see that I'm able to actually turn the lens when it's in the housing. So that's really cool, because now you can zoom in and out with your camera system. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to be able to trigger our strobes. Now, when your camera takes a photo, in order to get the blues in your photo out of the frame, you're going to need artificial lights, like an underwater strobe or a video light. Now, if you want the strobe to fire when you fire your camera, you're going to need a triggering mechanism on the camera itself. One way is to use sync cords. So you would have a sync port on one of your bulkheads. On this housing, you've got an M24 bulkhead, and you also have an M14 bulkhead. So you could add a sync cord port there. Or you can use fiber optic cables. Now, fiber optic cables are great because they allow you to trigger the strobe with light coming from the camera all the way to your strobe without actually penetrating the housing. Now they do that because you have a fiber optic port inside, or on top of your housing right here, that will transfer the light through the fiber optic cable to the strobe. So the one item I'm missing in all of this that's out with our rentals right now is a flash trigger. A flash trigger is basically a little LED box with two batteries in it, and the LEDs will fire and put light out from the camera, and they go through the fiber optic port and then to your strobe. So the way you attach the flash trigger is you actually take the hot shoe cover off the camera, and then you just slide the flash trigger onto the camera and make sure you turn it on so that the LEDs fire when you fire the camera. So that's the one thing I can't show you guys, but that's how it works. if you want to fire your strobes, you need a flash trigger to slide into the hot shoe mount. That's the top mount that you can see on the camera itself. But for now, we will not be connecting that, though I will show you how to connect fiber optic cables. So, after you put your camera and lens inside of the housing, you can now put the back of the housing onto the camera. But before we do that, we want to make sure that this seal will be completely good and that there's not going to be any issues with any flooding. So we have two things. We have a leak detection system. The leak detection system has these two prongs on the bottom of the back panel of the housing. If any water touches that system, it will start beeping. Now, in order to have a functioning vacuum system for your Sony a7S III housing, you need a vacuum valve. Now, we highly recommend getting a vacuum valve with every Nauticam housing because it allows you to put a seal on your housing, basically create a vacuum seal on your housing in order to test if air or water will come in over time. So a vacuum valve and a vacuum system will not help you underwater. It's not going to protect your housing underwater, but if you do a vacuum check before you get in the water, about 15 minutes before, then you know for certain when you go in the water, your vacuum seal is tight and nothing can get inside the housing like water. So this is an M14 vacuum valve. M14 is basically the size of the bulkhead, which is a hole, an opening on your housing that you can use for accessories. So you have an M24 right here, which is great for, you could put sync cords here, you could put monitors, so you could put HDMI cables, anything you would want there. I find that the back panel is really good for vacuum systems, so the M14 port here is great. I just took off this M14 cap with a screwdriver, and now I'm ready to put this M14 vacuum valve on the M14 port. So all you have to do is screw it in, but before you screw it in, just make sure that your O-ring on the bottom of the M14 port is nice and clean and clear. And has a little bit of lubrication on it as well with O-ring grease. And now you can screw it in. Now I hand screw it in, but then you'll reach a certain point where it feels kind of tight and it's not all the way down to the bottom. You want to make sure that that bottom O-ring doesn't fall out, doesn't get pinched, anything like that. And now I take this Nauticam tightening tool and I can tighten down the vacuum valve onto the housing. And now, if you put your housing completely together, you are able to do a vacuum seal and check if anything will get inside your housing. But we're not ready to do that yet. And the reason for that is because we don't have a port on our housing. So I'm going to show you how to put a port over your housing. Now with every housing and every lens combination, it's going to be a different port system. In order to determine what ports you need, what extensions you need, what adapters you need, we have port charts on our website. So all you have to do is go to the port section of the website and click port charts. We have ports for every brand of housing, every camera, and you can read them and see, okay, so for this lens you would need this zoom gear, this extension, this adapter, this port. And that will help you get situated. But if you're still confused, make sure you reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. We'll get you set up with a system, and you can also chat with us on our website as well. So the best way to put a port together is first to put the zoom sleeve on the lens. Once you've got your lens zooming and focusing, if you need a focus sleeve, now you're ready to put the port together, and the final step is to put the port on the housing. So in order for me to do that, I like to put the port together first and then put the port on the housing last. Some people like to start bottom up instead, and they like to put the adapter on first and then the extension and then the port. But the reason I like to start with the port is because sometimes extensions have locks on the inside, and it's easier to put it on the port and lock it from the inside than it is to start with the housing, because then you can't really lock it. So here I have a 180 millimeter dome, which is good for the 16 to 35 millimeter wide angle lens that I have on the housing. So all I need to do is first take this extension And the most important thing when you're putting an extension port or adapter on a Nauticam housing is to look at the dots. So there is a circular dot on the port, there's circular dots on the extension you can see right here, and there's a circular dot right here on the housing itself, right? So the trick to putting a port system on your housing is to line all the dots up. There are also dashes on each one of these contraptions, and the dash tells you the starting point. It says, okay, first line the dash to the dot on the port, and then you can spin your adapter or your extension ring, and it will line the dots up all together in a row like so. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, don't get discouraged. The first time putting a port system together can be very daunting, can be a little difficult, and sometimes you just have to keep practicing in order to get it right. For me, it always feels like my first time because I shoot so many different kinds of housings, so many different cameras, that every camera system can be daunting. But here's how you would put together this port system right here. So I have a 180mm port. I'm going to line this dash up with the dot by pushing the dash onto the dot. Now, I don't like touching the glass with my hand, so I usually like to just put the whole system in my lap and put it together, and I also like to hold on to the dome with the dome shade, but you just want to make sure you got all the screws in and it's tight. And now I can twist so that the dots now completely line up between the extension and the port. Now you see the internal lock, which is supposed to be raised when you're putting the system together. Now I can push this down and close it. You just have to make sure it's lined up perfectly to do so. And now I can close that lock, and this extension is locked on to the port. The next thing I can do is I can do the same process with the port adapter. So with the port adapter, the lock is a little bit different. It's an external lock, but the process is the same. You take the dash on the port adapter, you line it up with the dot on the extension and push it down. And now I can spin this so that now all the dots line up between the port adapter, the extension, and the dome. In order to make the final lock, I just push down the red button, I spin this little tab, push it down, and now the port adapter is locked onto the extension, and I've got my full port system ready to go on the housing. So, the final step in all of this is to attach the port to the housing. Nauticam is very well known for having a really easy system, a really easy port locking lever that can do this. Now, when the lever is moved out, that means the port locking system is unlocked. When you push it in, it's locked. You won't be able to move that when you're underwater unless you push down the button. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the back on because we now have installed the vacuum valve. And now that the vacuum valve is ready, let's actually go ahead and turn the vacuum system on. So I've got this blue and red blinking light on the back. It should be blue, but because I have a low battery, it's blue and red. And now I can go ahead and put this on the housing. Again, I've got my latches, so they just push shut, and now I've got the back of the housing onto the front of the housing, and I can place my housing on the back, and I open the port lock like so, just by pushing that tab down. And finally, I can line the dot up from my port adapter, there's a little dot right there, onto the dot on the housing, and all I have to do is push it down carefully and even. You want to be as even as possible, which I always struggle with personally. And now I can push that down, and as long as there's no O-ring visible on any side, I can lock the port onto the housing just by flipping that lever, and now my housing is fully contained and waterproof. So now that I've successfully attached my port to the system, it is now watertight, and it's time to do a vacuum check to make sure that no water goes into the system. 15 minutes before you dive, again, you're just doing this in order to make sure your O-ring is clean and sealed when you put the housing together. So in order to run a vacuum check, now that I've installed the vacuum, all I have to do is turn the switch on. Make sure you have a nice fresh 2032 battery like I just installed right here. If you do, your back panel will start blinking blue, and you can actually go ahead and attach it to the back of the housing like so. Just gonna go ahead and lock it now. And now you can see the blue. Oop, that did not attach successfully. Sorry guys, it's hard to do this on a camera. Oh, okay, good. Okay. So now you have a blue LED indicating it's time to pump a vacuum. So you can take your Nauticam vacuum pump and place it over the vacuum valve, snug and firm. And now you can just pull a couple pumps, it'll start showing yellow. And then as you pump, it'll turn from yellow to green. Once it's green, I usually like to give it 1 or 2 more pumps. And now you can see the housing is green, and it's going to be analyzing the vacuum seal. So the final thing that you want to do once you have your vacuum all sealed up is to put the vacuum cap on the vacuum valve. And you always want to make sure you take that underwater. I highly recommend getting some spare vacuum valve caps because they're easy to lose. But now you could basically go in the water with this housing, because after 15 minutes, if your vacuum has remained green, you know that you're not going to get water in the housing and you're ready to get in the water. Most people are probably not going to get in the water like this with their housing system because they're probably going to want artificial lighting to bring back your colors underwater. Now, one final thing I should mention about the vacuum system: when you are done using the housing and you've been done diving with it, you're done for the day, you need to undo the vacuum in order to open the housing. If you try to open the housing right now, the vacuum is actually holding that back panel in place. So in order to undo the vacuum, you just press the red button on top. You can hear that sound of the air coming out. The LED indicator now blinks red, and you can open up your back panel. And in order to reset the vacuum, you're going to need to turn that on and off switch. Off and then on. And now you're ready for your next dive. Now, you don't have to reset the vacuum after every dive, of course. If you're going to do multiple dives, you can just keep it vacuum sealed. The only reason you need to undo the vacuum is if you need to take the port off. Okay, so this is the fun part, and my favorite part of the system. Let's set up some artificial lighting. Let's set up some strobe lighting. And the first step to that is to attach your arms and clamps. So we often get the question, what kind of arms and clamps do I need with my underwater housing system? I usually, for most professional high-end systems, I recommend one 5-inch arm and one 8-inch arm. Now, if you're really into wide-angle shooting, you might do well with 2 8-inch arms. If you have a more compact system or a smaller system, you could probably get away with one 5-inch arm. But the reason I recommend one 5-inch arm and one 8-inch arm is because it allows you the most versatility. You can get your strobes really far out for wide-angle shots, and you can also bring them in and get some creative lighting. So what I'm going to do is take this clamp, and I'm going to try to clamp my ball of the arm to the ball of the housing. Now, a lot of people get this confused. I have some colored clamps here today from Ultralight so that you can see, where to put the ball. One of the confusing things about the clamp is that it looks very similar on all 3 sides of it. One thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to try to clamp the ball mount to the handle. This is actually the handle of the clamp. You want to put it in between the 2 black sections. Now, if you just have a black clamp, this can be a little bit hard to tell. So I should say the thicker ends of the clamp are the sections where you want to put the ball in between. So you take the ball, and I usually just like to loosen up my clamps. I don't loosen up too much, but a little bit. I put the ball in between so it's easy, and I try to hold the ball in place as I put the other side of the clamp on the ball in the housing. And then it's really easy to just tighten up, and now you've got your clamp in place. So I'm going to go ahead and clamp my next clamp on with And yeah, I might have to loosen it a bit. You can hear my clamps are getting old, so they're squeaking a bit. It can always be a good idea to replace the springs and O-rings periodically. I've had these for almost 10 years. And I'm gonna go ahead. Ooh. Of course, I'm much slower about this on camera. If I'm off camera, it's very quick. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the 8-inch arm on. Now, you might notice that these arms are kind of loose, right, above water. Well, underwater, the buoyancy helps hold the arms tight and in place. So above water, I tend to tighten up the clamps a little more, but not too tight because otherwise you'll damage the springs. And underwater, I loosen them up. And when I am adjusting my arms and clamps underwater and moving them around, what I like to do once I get in the water, I will do a quick quarter turn to the left and then tighten it back up so it's mostly hand tight, and that'll keep your strobes in place just enough so that they're in place when you need them to be, but you can also move them around when you want to move them around. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this side up. And I'm going to add my strobe. So my strobe has a ball mount. Sometimes you can have a strobe on a YS mount, but that'll usually have a ball at the end. I'm going to tighten this up. So now I've got one side all tightened up and ready to go. And now I'm going to do the same thing over here. Oh, but I did actually decide to include a special clamp. This is called a triple clamp, and it has 3 sides so that you can put, an arm here and maybe a light on this side, and maybe attaching it to the arm. Now, triple clamps are very difficult to attach, and they can be a little bit annoying at first until you get the hang of it. It's all about trying to cup your hand and put the balls in the triple clamp so that they all line up perfectly. So I've got my triple clamp here, and I usually start with one side. So with one side I've got here, I have a ball, and then I have a light that I want to add. And finally, you can see I'm just trying to cup the light in, do whatever I can to keep all 3 of these in place. I've loosened it up, and now I'm going to tighten it down as quick as I can so that these balls fall into place. Oop. Here we go. And now I've got the 3 prongs of my triple clamp all set up so that I now have a video light, which I can have on one side, and I'm going to add an underwater strobe to the other side. So that's pretty cool. So I am going to continue with my setup. I've got my clamp and arm section. And then I'm going to add my final clamp and my strobe over here. Hopefully you guys can see everything I'm doing. And this is a full arm setup with strobes. Now, I'm not done yet. And the reason I'm not done yet is because I need a way for these strobes to actually fire. Now, you may have noticed with these YST3s, there is one mistake I made. I have the sync cord port open. Normally there is a cap that screws on here, but I left these at home because I was actually shooting these with sync cords most recently. But if you have the strobes right out of the box, the port cap is right there. If you have sync cords, you know what I'm talking about. So it is going to look a little bit different here. Now I can still show you how to attach fiber optic cables, which are by far more popular with Nauticam housings. So here I have a Nauticam style fiber optic cable. Now with Nauticam housings, I highly recommend using the Nauticam Universal cable. It's because it's a multi-core cable, which means it has more fibers inside of the cable, which transmit light a lot better. And it's great if you want to do TTL, or basically automatic strobe power. You're going to want a multi-core cable, so I recommend the Nauticam Universal cables. But we also have our Blue Water style cables that attach onto Nauticam housings. Now with the Nauticam fiber optic ports, all you do is you just screw the cable on here, like so. And then this end of the cable, the YS end, goes right into the strobe port like that. And when you turn on your camera, you can also turn on your strobe. And if you had a flash trigger, which I do not, as I mentioned, when you take a photo, it should make the strobe fire just through the cable like so. Now I wanted to include a normal CNC to CNC end here because I wanted to make 2 points that are very important. One, you really need a Nauticam style fiber optic cable in order to lock on to this male thread. You need a female port or cable. Now, if you have a CNC cable and you've forgotten your Nauticam cable, I have a very cool trick I can show you. You can actually do something called slave triggering. So you can actually trigger your other strobe just by connecting this cable to your strobe here. I think the slave port on the D3 is on the side. I haven't actually done this since the YSD2J, but you can connect from the slave port to your second strobe in the normal optical port, and now you've got a way that you can bypass the housing in case you broke a cable or you needed a spare cable or needed for whatever reason to make this strobe your slave. The important thing is to just remember, if you're in slave mode, you're going to want to go to TTL and then hold the button down, and it'll turn actually dark blue is slave. It looks like I was using slave already, probably because I was doing some remote triggering with the strobe, but that's some more advanced stuff. We can talk about that, and feel free to drop a comment below if you're interested. Okay, so now we have a full system set up almost. The last thing I like to have on my housing system is a lanyard. So this is an ultralight lanyard. You can get one from Nauticam, and you can attach it in different places. The nice thing about Nauticam housings, they actually have an attachment point right at the base of the ball mounts on the housing. So now you can actually just carry the whole system like so. You want to be careful with heavy domes, and obviously I haven't tightened my strobes up enough, so that is a little bit ungraceful. Another thing I like to have is I actually like to have a wrist lanyard, which I didn't include today. And sometimes I just like to attach a wrist lanyard as well, so that when I'm shooting underwater, I got something on my wrist to hold it down, or strapped to my BC so I keep everything taut and nice. Let me go ahead and tighten this up. And there we go. This is our full Nauticam housing system all set up. I'm going to go ahead and take it down and include that as like a little time-lapse video. So anyway, if you like this video, please make sure you like and subscribe. It really supports our content. I hope this helped you out and you feel like you have a better understanding of how to set up your Nauticam underwater housing. If you have any questions at all, make sure you reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. We're happy to get you set up with a system. Every one of our purchases includes a free Zoom setup call. So that's very cool because we'll walk you through this. But hopefully after watching this video, you feel like a pro at just setting up your Nauticam housing. But if not, we're here for you. We have the best service in the industry, and we hope that you shop with us soon.